Week 4 of the fantasy football season is already here. And to get us started to set our winning lineups, I'm bringing in Michael Fabiano, SI's senior fantasy analyst. Fabs, let's kick it off with the quarterback position. Who are we trusting this week?
It's been a strange season when after 3 weeks I have to tell people when to start Aaron Rodgers. He hasn't been good this year. He's averaging 12 points a game. That's pathetic. But here's the good news. He seemed to have found a number one wide receiver last week in Romeo Doubs, and he's got the Patriots this week. They've given up 6 touchdown passes and an average of over 21 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. This is not your father's Patriots defense. Start Aaron Rodgers, and then let's go over the pond to see Kirk Cousins and the Minnesota Vikings face the New Orleans Saints. And I like Cousins this week. He's had 18-plus fantasy points in 2 of 3 games, and that one game that he didn't have 18 that was on a Monday night. We know what happens to Captain Kirk on those days. He's also had 12 touchdowns and averaged almost 25 fantasy points a game in 4 career meetings against New Orleans. I see Kirk Cousins as a low-end QB1.
And as far as who we're sitting at quarterback, you have the reigning Super Bowl champion quarterback and one of my top waiver wire claims on the sit list.
And Matthew Stafford is coming off of a dreadful game. No touchdown passes. It was the first time that he hasn't had 1 touchdown pass at least in a game in his last 27 regular season contests. Now he's got the Niners. They've given up the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks so far this year. And in his last road game against the Niners, Stafford had 9.8 fantasy points. He is a super flex option at best. And I think Trevor Lawrence is in that same category. Listen, he was great last week. And maybe at the end of the week, Jen, I'll be having egg on my face. But I don't like this matchup against the Eagles. Their defense has allowed an average of just 11 points per game to that quarterback spot. This is a very tough matchup for Trevor Lawrence. If he lights up the Eagles like he did the Chargers, I will come on the air next week and say I was wrong, but the matchup says sit Trevor Lawrence in traditional leagues.
We always tell you in fantasy football to be sure to draft your handcuff, or even better yet, draft your opponent's handcuff. And this week, that could really be paying off because there are some juicy matchups for the next guys up.
Yeah, Jamal Williams is going to play a big role this week with DeAndre Swift dealing with that shoulder injury. And last week, he had 2 touchdowns, almost 25 fantasy points. JW was unbelievably productive, and now he's going to be the lead guy against the Seahawks. They were just crushed by Cordero Patterson last week. So Jamal Williams, he's in my top 10 running backs for the week, Jen. And then let's talk about Khalil Herbert. Now, at this point in time, we're unsure of David Montgomery's status. But if Montgomery cannot play this week, Herbert is a virtual must-start against the Giants. They gave up 178 rushing yards to Zeke, Pollard. How about the Cowboys on Monday night? So it's a good matchup, and Herbert was fantastic last week when David Montgomery went down.
Khalil Herbert certainly was fantastic, much to the chagrin of those of us who started David Montgomery expecting him to have a big day. But hey, it's fantasy football. There is some luck involved. Now let's talk about who we are going to sit at the running back position. You got a couple of guys from the same draft class here.
And let's start off with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's been really good this year. Double-digit points in every single game. Although last week he had 7 carries and no yards. And he scored a touchdown on the ground, which is just so strange. But he's probably going to be a flex starter in a lot of leagues, Jen, because he's been so good. But beware the matchup against the Buccaneers. Their defense has allowed the fewest fantasy points to running backs this season. And last week, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon scored 11.5 points combined. This is a bad defense when it comes to the run. They can stop just about anybody. So keep that in mind when you're putting Clyde Edwards-Helaire in your lineup. And then Cam Akers. Last week, hey, he got into the end zone. He still wasn't very good, though. He had 12 touches. Darrell Henderson only had 4. That's the good news. The bad news is that Henderson and Akers basically split the snaps down the middle in that backfield. Akers is a flex at best against the Niners. They've given up the fewest fantasy points to running backs dating back to last year in their last 8 games. So even though Akers is seeing his value rise a little bit, I still don't trust him.
And that fumble, too. You just got to wonder, how much are they going to trust Akers? That I want to trust him, but yeah, I feel you. Okay, moving over to the wide receiver position, we are going to trust our boy Amari Cooper because he's had 2 identical 101-yard, 1 touchdown games in a row. Does he go for 3?
I mean, I don't know if he's going to have 100 again, but he's been darn good. And I didn't think he would be this good with Jacoby Brissett under center. So I'm going to ride him while he's hot. Not only has he had 202 yards, 2 touchdowns, and over 48 fantasy points in his last 2 games, Jen, but he's also seen a 36% target share. No other Browns wide receiver has more than 6.9. Atlanta's giving up the 6th most fantasy points to receivers lined out wide. So Amari Cooper is in the wide receiver 2 conversation. And let's stay in that same game. We love the Drake, at least Drake London in Atlanta. He's been great. I mean, look at his numbers. 17.1 fantasy points per game in his first 3 NFL games. I'd keep him in your lineup this week against the Browns. They've given up 4 touchdowns and the 5th most fantasy points to receivers lined out wide. Drake London, I don't know if he's going to be this year's Jamar Chase, but he's had a really good start to his NFL career.
And on this week's sit list, a couple of veterans I think we're going to be getting a lot of questions about. Both DJ Moore and Allen Robinson. What do we do?
I would fade Moore, and I thought he would be better with Baker Mayfield. He hasn't been. He's had really one okay game. And last week he scored 2.5 fantasy points. He's caught 3 or fewer passes in 3 straight games. And there's also the concern that the remnants of Hurricane Ian could affect this game on Sunday. So there could be weather going on in this one. So DJ Moore, unless you're desperate for a flex, is probably better off on your bench. And you mentioned Allen Robinson. Like, what's going on here in Los Angeles? We thought, well, he's got the best quarterback he's ever had in Matt Stafford. He'll bounce back from last year. He's had 2 stinkers in his first 3 games. Matt Stafford is targeting, of course, Cooper Kupp, but also Tyler Higbee more often. And this is a tough matchup against the Niners, who've given up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So Allen Robinson is a fade, and he's been a big-time disappointment through 3 weeks.
Super disappointing. Speaking of disappointing, let's talk about the tight end position. Okay, I shouldn't go that far, but it is a tough position. Who are we trusting this week?
It's so hard to trust anybody, right? Not named Kelsey or Andrews at this point. I'm going to trust Pat Freiermuth. I know he didn't have a great game last week. I get that, 6.1 fantasy points, but he had scored at least 7.2 fantasy points in his previous 9 games dating back to his rookie year. And this isn't even a good matchup, John. I mean, the Jets actually held Mark Andrews to a low total. He's the only tight end to score double digits against them this year. But I think Mitchell Trubisky will look to Freiermuth a little bit more often than they did last week. And because this is such a thin position, I continue to start Pat Freiermuth. And I'm going to start Gerald Everett too. Last week was not a good week. It wasn't a good week for a lot of the Chargers players, but now they have the Texans. This is a really good matchup. The Chargers should be dominating this game. With or without Keenan Allen, I think Gerald Everett is a borderline tight end 1. And what should be a team that scores maybe 30 points against Houston's porous defense.
And as far as who we're sitting at the tight end position, who doesn't make the cut this week?
Yeah, Irv Smith Jr. I liked him last week, and he let us down, unfortunately. Now he's going to be in London against the Saints. And the Saints defense has been very tough on the tight ends. In fact, they haven't given up a touchdown to a tight end in 8 straight games dating back to last year. And I get it. Irv Smith was a guy you picked up. Maybe you have to play him. The matchup's not great. And how about Hunter Henry? I mean, this guy's done an absolute Houdini act. He was a top 10 tight end last year. This season, in the first 3 games, 5 targets, 6 fewer than Jonnu Smith, his teammate, and he ranks tied for 17th among tight ends in routes run per PFF. That's not very good. Now, the Packers are not great against tight ends, but Hunter Henry is simply not seeing any volume at all, and I can't play him, especially when Brian Hoyer is the quarterback for New England.
Fantastic advice, as always. For all of Michael Fabiano's start-sit recommendations, be sure you visit us at si.com/fantasy. And of course, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on YouTube so you won't miss a single SI Fantasy video for waiver wire or start sits.